Okay, we do have it started, and I am sharing the screen right now. Just again, this is for the recording. This is AA4FL for the Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds on the AirNet, and this will be a presentation on the life cycle versus the solar cycle, the strategies and times to be radioactive. And before I get started with the actual slides in the presentation, that right now I'm just going to give the audio narration for the audio stream and on the air. But I will also include a visual of what NetLogger looks in, and the people are checked in, and the actual chat feature. So for those of you that aren't currently using NetLogger, realize we do use it, at least when I'm the one that's net control. So you can check in by NetLogger, and you can interact with me in real time to ask questions. The feedback, especially on 20 meters, is very valuable because perhaps not everyone can hear. If you're using the web stream, though, in NetLogger, that's a way to get back to net control. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close those windows in my presentation now and start giving you a narration of the actual material on the life cycle versus the solar cycle, strategies and times to be radioactive. And this is a variation of a presentation I recently gave to the St. Augustine Amateur Radio Society on behalf of the North Florida DX Association, where I'm currently president of that group. And we have a wonderful group of amateurs in North Florida, centered around the Jacksonville area, that participate in DX and have their wealth of information for strategies to be radioactive, to be effective. And these were carried forth into this presentation, and we're going to be doing it in the context of amateur radio operators who are in the health-related fields and have relatives that are in health-related fields, or relatives that might have an interest in ham radio. You don't have to be in the field as a working professional or a retired person from the workforce. As long as you're interested in a health-related subject, it can be a Medical Amateur Radio Council involved either as a member or just as a participant in our nets. But if you want to see more about our organization, it is marco-ltd.org, marco-ltd.org. And of course, that's here on this opening slide of the PowerPoint that I'm recording. I'm also a trustee of W4DFU at the University of Florida, as well as being secretary of Marco. And you can always see my QRZ page for additional information. This is AA4FL. So where in the world can you work? I mean, amateur radio operators, if you have the right conditions, right antennas, the right equipment, and in the past, it was limited to HF, being able to work the world. You can talk anywhere in the world. But nowadays, that's not necessarily a limitation. Those of us that had high-powered stations in the past, maybe lived in houses that you had towers or large antennas. Maybe you don't have that living environment now. And if you don't, there's still ways to talk the world. There's stealthy antennas you can have on smaller properties. There's digital radio that you can do. I mean, I've spoken through digital radio to the Persian Gulf in my car while driving. So there's all kinds of options, but there's no limitations in where one can talk on amateur radio. And we'll start getting into that discussion. But what about the modes involved? I mean, do you speak? We just mentioned digital modes. In the past, that was PSK 31, and people just gave you all the information about their lives at PSK 31. In contrast, currently FT8 and the other current digital modes are available. And those are on the opposite end of conversational. They're just 13-character strings, but they have their place in DX, and they have their place in DX. What is DX to one is not DX to another. I mean, traditionally, we're talking about multiple countries for DX, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, what if DX for your operating conditions is being QRP and working across the country? This could be a DX contact. And what modes will we use? I mean, do we have to actually have a digital mode, or are there analog modes that involve voice over IP or being able to use a cell phone network on your cell phone? Can you use these different modes? Things like Echolink. And there's lots of digital modes too. And I guess the issue also becomes what happens with the different proprietary digital modes. You have DMR, D-Star, Fusion, and maybe you have a radio, but it doesn't do all of them. Well, here at Marco, we use a service called the QuadNet Array, and it transcribes or transcodes all these different modes. So we can talk to each other. And we have a net at 9 o'clock in the morning on Sundays that does that. But what about your traditional amateur modes? I mean, AM, of course, it's pretty much the past. There's aficionados that use it. You might be a shortwave listener and use it. You've got sideband, CW, RTTY, and FM. You've got many other modes to use as well. We'll put those in context as well as what frequency you're going to use for the conversations that you want to have. So to find operating time in the life cycle, you must be in sync with the solar cycle. I mean, just because the solar cycle has excellent operating conditions, it doesn't mean that you're in a place in the life cycle where you can participate. Perhaps you don't have the antenna equipment now. Perhaps you have a family member, a grandchild or a child that is a student, and they're in school and they're young and they haven't established a station at their houses yet. You can be a shortwave listener. That's how I got started in 1971. And I was a novice in 1972. Now you can go right on to technician, and the licenses are easy to obtain, and technicians can do so much, and we'll cover that now in terms of operating conditions. And then for me personally, there were times during high school, during graduate school, that dental school, I didn't have time for radio. And as time went on, I was able to operate the college station, get interested in amateur radio again. I had to take a break for children. That's part of the life cycle. And the business, to run a business, that took me quite a while. I really wasn't able to get active again until 2005. And I've even gone on a few de-expeditions since that time. And of course, the trustee at W4DFU at the university since 2005. So if you really want to see information about me, just look at my QRZ page and you can read that at your leisure. So what about the solar cycle? We're in solar cycle 25 right now. We're exceeding all expectations, the predictions on about all of them, quite a number of them. And it's, pretty decent operating conditions right now. I mean, NASA even recognized that it's exceeding predictions, and you'll be able to look at the PowerPoint when I post the link and see some of the charts involved in some of the links. But we're basically reflected by interaction with the sun if we're counting on propagation, and the choices of modes and bands are related to current conditions, the daily conditions, which are connected to the solar cycle. So, I mean, you do have charts and graphs that suggest what bands to get on. We live in the age of the internet, so that information is easy to obtain, and being reflected by interaction with the sun, radiation and ionization. We've got some charts that explain some of that in this presentation as well. So in history, you would have had to gone to the oracle at Delphi, in ancient Greece, to ask questions of the high priestess to know the answers of the world. So I don't think you need to travel to Delphi to see Pythia and ask her questions and the other priestesses. You have Google and other search engines. So at your fingertips, you have all kinds of information you can obtain: ionospheric propagation, radio waves, to whatever level that you want to delve into it. You don't have to be technically inclined. And to those of us in the health-related field, some of us are more computer savvy than others, but almost all of us have a cell phone, which is the equivalent of a computer in your hand. And you can certainly research whatever you want to know and use it as an aid in working other stations. That's information we will cover here. So there's different layers of the ionosphere, as we know, in radio propagation. And the PowerPoint presentation will include links that you can explore for radio propagation, or again, hit up the search engines yourself to learn more about the different layers, the D layers, the E layers, the F layers, F1 and F2, and how we reflect signals back, and what happens with VHF and UHF frequencies. So that you'll be able to explore more on your own, but most of you that are amateur radio operators already know these basics because you're licensed. But you may have relatives that want to use the information on the stream or the PowerPoint presentation that we'll distribute, and for them, this PowerPoint may be very helpful. But we know that also the types of antennas affect the angle of radiation. The incident angle affects what you're going to achieve using skywave propagation, and that's very antenna dependent. You get lower of incident angles, give greater distances, and skip zone signals can't be received by skywave or ground wave. So in a skip zone, I have that problem here. Stations in Florida can't hear me off the back of my beam. So that's why we also have a running audio stream. There's online resources that sort of collate all this information if you don't feel like using a search engine to look for particular words. Areas like the DX Zone, dxzone.com. There are a large created and maintained library of websites dedicated to amateur radio, like 20,000 links, but they categorize it into 600 plus categories and subcategories. So you can review that site, you can pick out different resources. If DX resources interest you, it's there. You can find information about manufacturers, internet and radio. It goes on and on and on in all those different categories. So we suggest that you check that out if you feel the need. Now, to get your DXCC award, we all know that there's an award, or most of us know that there's an award for talking around the world, for talking to radio entities. And we have, I don't remember the current count right now, in the 340s. And you need to talk to all but 10 to get on the, I believe, to get the DXCC award to be on the honor roll. And I've got an image of my DXCC, which dates to 1979. So that's when I was finishing up my last flurry of activity before I took a break from 2005. And in the PowerPoint presentation, it will show that I was at DXCC 150 at that point. And since 2005, and having propagation one cycle, I've been able to get that count up to 330. And you'll be able to see that in graphical display. We'll put that in context as what we talk about today. But if you're not only a member of the DXCC Century Club, but when you're the ARL and you're registering for that club, you're sending in all your data, your cards, your digital contacts, and you get back a chart. They chart everything for you so that you know which award, which bands, etc. And you get a report every time you make an online submission, which is what most people do this day. It saves a lot of money from having to send out cards. So antennas, I mean, do you have to have an expensive directional antenna with gain? I mean, I'm fortunate here at my house that I have an 80-foot tower with a directional antenna. I used to have a satellite array with cross-polarized Yagis. I donated that to the university for one of their CubeSat projects, so they have a backup ground station. I use egg beater antennas. So the egg beater antennas are not directional, but W4DFU at the university, I'm also very lucky enough to have the same on top of an 11-story building, and we also have satellite array. So I'm going to let this drop one before I continue on with a PowerPoint presentation, just to identify this is AA4FL for the Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds in the Air. Yeah, this is AA4FL for the Grand Rounds in the Air, the Medical Amateur Radio Council. This presentation is being recorded as a PowerPoint Zoom recorded session for distribution later, but you also have the web stream available at marcoaudio.net, both live and recorded. So please feel free to listen at this time or later. And if you can't get access to the link to the recorded PowerPoint presentation, feel free to email me at my QRZ address. That's AA4FL. Just look me up on QRZ. I'll be more than happy to send you the link. So antennas, do they need to be complicated? Do they need to be expensive? That's not necessarily true. When I was in the Central Pacific on a DXpedition, I went to Fiji and I went to Tarawa on my way to Bonobo Island in 2013. I just threw a GR5, a junior GR5, boy, I'm mutilating the name of the antenna. But a small antenna up and a wire antenna was able to work the world without any problems. But also, what if you have a small property? I ironically, because I was on T33, which is a rare entity, and I worked 2,000 stations there, I didn't get DXCC credit for it. There was a T33 expedition last year, I believe it was, 2023, maybe 2022, and I didn't have a credit for that because my expedition was in 2013. Again, the solar cycle, you have to be there when the contacts are able to be made. So what I did, I didn't have a 30-meter directional antenna. I just threw a very stealth inverted V up in the trees. And on the PowerPoint presentation, you'll see the image. There's 3 photographs, although I doubt you can see the dipole because it's that stealthy. I mean, think about how easy that would be. You're only talking about inverted V. Each leg of the inverted V is 23 feet on 30 meters. And what if you were on 10 meters? What if you had a technician license? What if you had your grandchild get a technician license or child get a technician license and you didn't really have room for an antenna? I mean, you could put one in the attic if you needed to. 10 meter Well, you're talking about a total length of a dipole is only 16 feet, and they can get on the modes. They can get FT8. They can do sideband on 10 meters. Each leg of a dipole is only 8 feet on 10 meters. I'm sure you can be stealthy with that or a vertical. And even 17 meters, which is a very reasonable band. For those of you that have generals, you could throw a stealthy antenna up that's 25 feet long. It's a great band. You don't have to worry about a lot of power in 17 meters as compared to 20 meters, where you have a lot of heavy hitters with a lot of power and multi-directional antennas. So you have more of a chance of working long distances under those working conditions. So how much power do you need? Well, again, it depends. It's propagation dependent, mode dependent. On sideband phone, you could be successful barefoot at 100 watts without a directional gain antenna using a dipole or vertical. But QRP would be more challenging. How you can work DX desirable stations and pileups when you're competing against people with power and or great antennas. So the best bands to try would be 10 meters, 12 meters, and 17 meters, because 20, 40, and 80 often require amplification to work the rare ones, or you can use other modes. You can use CW modes on those bands that tend to be more crowded on voice. That helps to overcome some of the limitations, smaller bandwidth and less competition. And of course, depending upon your license class, if you're an extra, you get the bottom 25 kilohertz of the bands. And if you weren't capable of doing other, if you're a technician, FT8 is also on 10 meters, as well as 6 meters. Your best bet for challenging band conditions, low power, simple wire antennas. In the case of FT8 on 10, on 6, that may not be true, but those digital signal processing modes pull the signals out of the noise, so you don't need as much of an antenna or power. And we talked about DX operating techniques in terms of Pythia in Google, and you can certainly search for many different ways to operate techniques, whether or not descriptions of how to use duplex, for example. You need to be able to use split frequencies on HF in order to weed de-expeditions, and strategies for how you do that will increase your effectiveness with less power and less antenna. You have to learn how to track a station, look at their operating patterns. If it's a DX station that's split, often you can overcome some of the limitations of the strong stations. You look for an open frequency and hope that the station listens for you. I mean, when I was in T33, I'm not really a great sideband operator. It's not my favorite mode, but they put me on 20-meter sideband. And you would spread things out so that many stations were calling you. And instead of having a wall of noise, you were able to pick them out of the mud or out of the wall of signals. And there's operating satellites. You have a family member that's a technician. There's no limitations on satellites other than being able to track them and work them. You can even do that with a handheld antenna, and it's very enjoyable. Isn't that ironic that the technician license, the first license, gives us the capability to talk to the International Space Station or to use satellites in orbit? To me, it's mind-boggling that technicians pass up on that opportunity, especially with the inexpensive equipment that's available now. So feel free to search. Some of those different sites are available for a shortcut on the PowerPoint presentation, but just use Google or whatever search engine you use. All that information is available for you. Just search for DX operating techniques and ham radio, see what you get. In working split, I provided a link to an excellent video in the PowerPoint presentation on working split. So it's one of those many techniques for increasing DXCC totals. Know how to use the two VFOs and a band scope if you have one on, like an ICOM 7300. You can get anything that's a visual display that shows you where you're at. And then you can find many digital radios, the flex lines, and the pan adapters are available for a lot of other lines as well. So, do not be the first to respond and listen. Listen for the operator's mode of operating. Just be the first person that responds. Split. Know their techniques, how they shift frequencies, how they move in the window that they're listening. They'll say split up 5 to 10, or they'll say split up 5, and they really mean up 5 to 10. Sometimes even more in a rear expedition. They may go 15 kilohertz. Some go more than that, but I don't think that's a great idea, tying up the bands for 20 kilohertz. But make sure to use great operating technique as well. Use great etiquette. don't be rude. If you're rude to a station, I had many when I was in Panama I wouldn't respond to. They were so obnoxious. I just ignored them and wouldn't call them if their etiquette was so poor that they were trashing the bands and causing QRF. And working split, I do have a link to a video of me talking to a Japanese station from T33. And you can hear a little bit of how the conversation went. And the importance of that is that the band was actually pretty clear. I only had one or two stations because of the split nature of the operation that I was trying to pull the call signs out, and I was able to handle that. This gives you the perspective of the DX station. And I want to give you the perspective, though, of operating with that in context, what you would do, the techniques that you would do. Use DX spots to work a lot of DX areas like DXWatch.com. There's DX Summit. There's DX Heat. What DX is on the air right now? What frequencies are they on? Are others in your area working now? And you can easily do that using spotting surfaces, but you also can use these spotting surfaces that allow you to search for specific bands or modes. If I only want to know who's on 10 meters and I want to know who's hearing them in North America because I'm a technician and I want to do sideband and I want to be bombarded with all the other reports, I can search for just that information. I can even choose where the stations that are reporting they are from and where I want to work, whether it be a particular station or a particular area. That being said, I'm going to take a little break for a second here to identify. This is AA4FL for the Grand Rounds on the Air. We're having a discussion on the life cycle versus the solar cycle strategies and times to be radioactive. At the end of my presentation, we're going to open it up for discussion. So I'm going to let it drop when we're not doing any late check-ins at this time, but we will do when I'm done with my presentation. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue on again on the Grand Rounds of the Air for the Medical Amateur Radio Council. We do have a net every Sunday morning open to all amateurs. Today it's a little more amateur radio centric. More often than not, it's some subject that's related to healthcare. Next week will be the benefits of honey. Last week, in honor of Valentine's Day, it was the physiology and medical considerations of chocolate. So it can be a lot of fun even when it's medical subjects. It doesn't necessarily have to be fully technical. Obviously, we hear your perspective from other members of our group that are retired physicians or current physicians or dentists or any other health-related fields, pharmacy, nursing, and they offer important feedback. It's not medical diagnosis, but it is important discussion topics. And we do get a chance to hear it from a perspective of healthcare providers. So now that we know that we can work DX, what about having help from your friends? What if you had a local group of hams that were interested in DX and they like to spot what they work? We have that here in the Jacksonville area. We have the North Florida DX Association out of Jacksonville. And what they do is they have a distribution list, an IO list, a groups list. And in real time, they'll give invaluable feedback, because maybe you're not always listening to a spot, but you can get the email. A lot of us look at our email, and I do have a list in the PowerPoint presentation showing where they've made posts for Mariana Islands, Yemen, and FT8 contacts for Australia. And this was all in one or 2 days before the presentation. There were reports this morning already too as well. And the other evening, someone worked the Juan Fernandez CB0 expedition on 6 meters, on 6 meter F. And this information came up. It has to be timely on 6 meters. If you don't know it right away, you're not going to be able to work it. So again, you can look for DX associations or organizations in your particular geographic area, and I'm sure they have similar content. You're welcome to check out nfdxa.com. That's the North Florida DX Association, nfdxa.com, and see how they do it. But what if you have a technician license? Again, can you work a lot of DX? Sure, just DX spot, set up a spot for 10 meter sideband. I did that and created a list here in my presentation. And I've got stations like VP8LP that were on the air from the Falkland Islands, Las Malvinas, off of the subantarctic areas, off of South America, off of Argentina. And it's fairly rare DX. And other stations that were on 10 meters that day, and including a lot of European DX. And that's all within one day, just from spotting, gives you an opportunity to work them. And I mean, that's sideband phone. If you don't have a lot of power, the same on FT8. I was able to generate a list for 10 meter FT8. Very modest antennas, very modest power. You can work well, stations all over the United States. 6 meters is open, but you can also work DX in Europe when it's open. And people were on that day. As I just mentioned, on 6 meters, they did that. But on 10 meters, there's lots of DX on that particular day. There was Hawaii, Brazil, Indonesia, Spain, Germany, Scotland. I'm looking down the list to see what other countries were here on that day. Slovenia, Finland, Netherlands, Poland. This was all on FT8 on 10 meters. So if the modest antenna causes you to have a need for FT8, yeah, you do what you can do. If you have a computer and you have FT8, you can put a stealthy antenna in your attic or out in the yard. You can work a lot of DX. You're not limited because the life cycle doesn't match up with the solar cycle. At that point, maybe you don't have the capability of having more power. It doesn't mean you can't work DX. It just means you may have to modify your operating conditions. And can you find out if other stations are returning your transmissions in real time? And if you're being copied, well, think about FT8. It's a digital mode. It's actually used for tracking. There's free software available. You can use DX Maps. There's DX Watch. There's other online services you can use. You can transmit and then see who's receiving you on FT8. I mean, even if you're working sideband and you put out an FT8 signal, you'll know where the propagation, where you're being received, at least on FT8. So if you did that on an HF band, then take that information to sideband. You have real-time information of choosing what band to operate on. And of course, you can also use spot services for that too, to see who's operating. So I've got some of those graphs in the PowerPoint. But for example, for me, one of the hobbies I like, aspects of the hobby, is 6 meter FT8. Because there's times when you can work things you couldn't work any other way. I've gotten Japan in the logbook. And I think I mentioned earlier that I haven't had a lot of time in my life cycle lately because of working at the University of Florida as faculty, as well as running a lot of organizations and family obligations. And when I do, I enjoy working 6 meter FT8. So I invest my time when I know the band's open, and I use spots for that. So I was able to get Japan, but because of the life cycle interferences, I was not able to pick up Australia, New Zealand, and that Juan Fernandez. Other areas in my area were working Fiji. I missed out on that too, on 6 meter FT8 this season. And of course, that's not necessarily the solar cycle as well, because you're also talking about sporadic heat. Sometimes sporadic heat is better outside of the solar cycle, so that even that gets complicated. But in terms of the science involved, I don't know all the physics, the atmospheric science physics that are involved down to the detail, but enough hams do. And using the spot sources, you don't have to know the physics. Can you a lot of DX on 6 meters? If you're a technician, of course you can. But it's sporadic E. You have to know when the sporadic E seasons are. The summer season, you can work all over the country. You don't need a lot of power. It's 6 meters. Again, the atmospheric science of that. I don't know if it's because of the wavelength, being so short, that there isn't a lot of frictional interaction with the ionization, but seems to take a lot less power for reflection. Again, I'm not trying to be definitive in terms of the atmospheric science. That's more observational. But yes, and you can work DX too on 6 meters FT8. The better the antenna, the better the DX, obviously. Do you have to spend a lot for logging? What about rig control software? No, you don't have to do any of that. You can use services like DX Keeper, which is part of the DX Lab Suite. There's online, freely available software. So what if you don't have radio or antennas? Can you go with digital modes? Of course you can go with digital modes, because those digital modes can be Echolink, which you can pick up on your phone. Well, that's analog, but it becomes digital because it's analog to digital through your cell phone, being voice over IP, or you can use a handheld radio with a hotspot, or a handheld radio with a local repeater. If you don't have the local repeaters, they have those services. You can use the hotspot as an on-ramp to the internet. And even simpler, if you just have a computer, you can get a USB dongle. And we do have a digital net. Just email me if you have any questions about our nets or how to operate DX on digital or just to operate digital radio, because it's really an underused segment. And if you don't have operating conditions at your house because you're limited in antennas or power by lot size, by apartment, just consider using the digital modes. You'll enjoy that immensely. For QSLing, I remember as a kid having to wait for the mailman to come to get a QSL card. Think about having to send out a QSL and how expensive that is. I mean, you have to confirm your contacts to get rewards. And an example was VP8LP. Even currently, Bob down in the Falkland Islands, he doesn't use Logbook of the World. You have to send a couple of green stamps. You send US dollar bills along with using the global forever postage, which right now I guess is about $1.50. So it's $3.50 to $4.50 to send off for a QSL. And you don't have to do that necessarily in most stations anymore. You can confirm as an alternative using services such as the outgoing QSL Bureau or the incoming QSL Bureau still send card, but in bulk through it. This information is in the PowerPoint. You can look up the ARL QSL bureaus as well, but that it takes 2 or 3 years to get replies. And why in the digital age you can instantly get a QSL. For example, that T33 station I was talking about needing for DXCC that I finally got a chance to work with that 30-meter stealth antenna, I was able to immediately get a reply. I had to send a little bit of money to get an immediate response, but I also got a QSL card as well as a Logbook of the World, almost instantaneous reply or confirmation. So stations who confirm electronically give you immediate confirmation. Many don't charge a penny for that. If it's an expensive DXpedition, if it costs $250,000, $750,000, you can understand why they'd ask for some money being sent to get an immediate confirmation. You can use clublog.org to see to check and see if you're in many of these DXpeditions logbook or DXstations logbook, and also to request QSL cards through that service. There's other services that people use for requesting QSL cards. That information generally is on the QRZ page. But check out clublog.org and register for that. And as I said, you can actually request your cards. How much you don't necessarily have to pay for an instant reply. You can also use Clublog off and agree to a bureau sent card. So you want to confirm your contacts electronically. Start with Logbook of the World. If you want it to be recognized for the DXCC awards, you need to go through Logbook of the World. And there's information on how to get started with that. You can go right on the Logbook of the World website and get that information. And you QSL with those contacts, and I put in the PowerPoint some graphics that show that, and how you can look up your different awards and track your awards, whether it be DXCC on the HF side or VUCC on the VHF side. Realize that grid squares are used. They're smaller geographic 2x1 degree segments for awards. And you can, I don't remember how many grids there are in the United States. Something from memory tells me in the 400s. But in Europe, think how close the countries are. So their grid squares give them many DXCC entities for 6-meter DXCC. Marco for Medical Amateur Radio Council, use your nets, as we just talked about. For your Marco members, don't think that it's limited working DX to amateur radio. We go on expeditions. A lot of times Marco gives you the opportunity to go off on expeditions or contests, either operating events, maybe parks on the air. And in doing that, ham radios for non-ham spouses as well. I took my wife, and some of our other members took their wives. We went to St. Lucia and rented a place for a week and had a wonderful time. Some photos in the presentation of that. So even these nets, when we talk about like the Valentine's Day theme we had, that's perfectly pertinent to spouses. There's no reason why they wouldn't want to hear about the medical benefits of chocolate. Next week, the benefits of honey. So thank you for listening and participating today and practicing great DXCC etiquette, great DX etiquette. And at this time, I'm going to stop the presentation. I appreciate everyone that's been here listening. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. And we're going to move on here to continuing the net and having discussions. So this is AA4FL.